Side proposition believes helping poor people in our own country is much more important than helping people overseas. So proud to propose. Now, some setup then. So first, what do we think the actors of this debate are? So the first one is poor people in one's own country. We mean like citizens who do not have access to basic necessities like food, homes, and etc. Second, people overseas are those affected by disasters or wars. And then third, the country we would be portraying and other countries suffering from disasters or wars, we think that would most likely be developing countries. And what would helping people in our own country and others look like? In our own country, we would provide them with basic necessities, and in other countries, we would be sending aids or donations. So our stance is clear then. We would help our poor people in our own country, and we think that it is more important than helping people overseas. Now, before I move on to my arguments, are there any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Seeing that there are none, let me move forward then. So I have two arguments in my speech then. First, it is about national responsibility, and second, assurance of proper aid. So first argument then. And so first layer of analysis then, for my first argument, why the citizens should be prioritized. Panel, citizens of a country are the ones who pay taxes, right? They follow national laws, they contribute to the country's economic growth. It would be morally wrong for a government to send aid overseas while its own citizens sleep on the streets or like face hunger or lack medical care. So our first responsibility must always be the people who build the country and depend on it. Ignoring domestic poverty while sending money abroad may be generous, yes, but it's also very irresponsible. And let's look at this way then. Your kid falls down and hurts one knee while your friend's kid falls down and hurts both knees. Would you really let your kid be just to aid someone else's kid? No, right? Exactly. And even if someone would, how would your own kid feel about that? We tell you that from the very get-go, the government's role was always to ensure that their own country and their own citizens is like improved and is well. In that regard, I feel like you need to properly build your own structure before helping others. It's not that you don't care about other people, it's just that you know by helping yourself, you can help others better. And like a sick patient can't help another sick patient, right? And second layer then on how it will strengthen the nation. We tell you that helping your own country inherently strengthens the nation. Why? Because your nation includes every single person in your country, the rich and the poor. The rich, they're already well, so your focus should be on the poor, right? So you should focus on helping them to live properly and to get clean resources that are not polluted or unhygienic. But panels, how are you supposed to ensure that you help them efficiently if most of your resources and your help is going to the other countries? Does it make sense, right? So now moving on to my second argument, which again is about assurance of proper aid. So first analysis then. So when aid is sent abroad, there are many risks, especially in conflict or disaster zones, right? In like war-torn countries such as Yemen or Gaza, humanitarian aid is often blocked or like interfered by with opposing sides. And like supplies can be destroyed before it even reaches the civilians, right? So like, and even in disaster situations, like destroyed infrastructure and dangerous conditions and communication breakdowns make it extremely hard to deliver help quickly and safely. And secondly, then on why local aid is more reliable. So in contrast, local aid is immediate and reliable, right? When a country helps its own poor people, we tell you that it can respond faster, and it also spends less on like transportation, and it ensures that every dollar directly benefits the citizens without little to no interference. And this efficiency makes local aid far more impactful than sending uncertain help across borders. And third and final layer then, like which is an example. So for example, during international crises like I've mentioned before, the Yemen or Gaza conflicts, millions in aid have been sent, but a large portion never actually reach the victims because of interference and corruption. But however, like we tell you on the other hand, when we focus sending when we focus like on our poor people in our own country, it will be more reliable. So panels, we tell you that helping our own poor people locally ensures certainty, safety, and transparency as well. So for all those reasons, then you must vote for side proposition. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we oppose the motion. Judge, I will do three things in my speech: rebut the proposition, set up the debate, and provide key arguments. Moral obligation is universal, not national, and global aid prevents greater harm and builds stability. First, rebuttals. Firstly, they talked about a knee analogy. However, instead of a knees, the change is drastic. For example, your son has had a paper cut and the person across the street is dying because they're drowning and nobody's around. Obviously, the clear scenario is to help the dying people. Secondly, they talked about resource distribution and how there won't be any resources left for the overseas aid. However, first, the idea that most resources should stay at home ignores how aid works, right? Overseas aid is a separate budget funded by international corporations, NGOs, or designated foreign aid programs. It's not a zero-sum game where every dollar abroad is stolen from a domestic program. Secondly, even if these resources are limited, efficiency does matter. Since proposition really cares about efficiency and using each dollar well, overseas aids actually often deliver more impact per dollar. Feeding a child, rebuilding a home, or vaccinating a village abroad can cost a fraction of what it would domestically. So even if we were to accept the premise of scarcity, we would have to invest in highest. More rebuttals into my speech. Our burden is to prove why helping people overseas is equally important to help people domestically, and why assisting more vulnerable and critical individuals are better. So the debate will look like as I rise. No, developed countries helping developing countries when they just got hit by a natural disaster, for example. This debate is not talking about whether helping people domestically is good. It absolutely is. But the motion asks us to rank importance, which moves me on to my first argument. Moral obligation is universal, not national. Imagine two people drowning. One in your backyard, one is across the street. If you could save either, do you ask them for their passport first? Of course not. Needs do not respect borders, and neither should compassion. The proposition implies that being born with a certain line on a map makes your suffering more important. That's not morality. That's nationalism disguised as charity, right? We agree that suffering is suffering. If a child is starving in a war-torn country and we have the means to help, it's morally indefensible to say, sorry, you're not from here. Our obligation is to humanity, not geography. However, and so prioritizing based on nationality creates a hierarchy, right? And it undermines the very, very essence of compassion. Now, in this case, it's even more obvious because instead of two people drowning, it's one that needs a paper cut, as I explained, and one that is getting burnt alive. Judge, look at the urgency and morality needed to create a sustainable community of countries overall. Second argument, global aid prevents a lot of greater harm and builds stability. Helping overseas isn't just morally right, it's actually very strategically smart. Poverty abroad often stems from the disasters, wars, or systematic collapse. If we ignore these crises, they escalate. Refugee flows increase, conflicts spill over, global instability rises. By helping overseas, we don't just save lives, we prevent future harm, including harm that can reach our own shores. Moreover, aid overseas often has outside impact, right? A small donation can feed a family, rebuild a school, or vaccinate a village. The proposition wants us to focus inward, but they ignore the multiplier effect of global aid. Helping abroad doesn't mean neglecting our own. It means recognizing that sometimes the greatest good lies beyond our borders. So what are we really debating? Whether compassion should be confirmed to a flag, whether need should be ranked by birthplace. We say no. We say help should be guided by urgency, not proximity, by impact, not identity. So why do all these reasons make us better than their initiative of helping domestically? We reach a wider audience. We help the people who need it most. We are the most efficient in collaboration with other countries. We help the people drowning, while proposition just helps their own nation to get a job. We help urgent care and therefore benefit the majority of the world much more. We oppose the motion because we believe in a world where humanity matters more than nationality. This is not a better world, it's a fairer one. Thank you, Judge.
Judge, we agree that countries overseas are also struggling and are also in dire need of help. That is why we are not completely rejecting help to them. We're giving you a different alternative. So proud to propose. But first on the clarification and strategic mistakes. For clarification, we never said that as a country we would not help other countries. We're just saying that we would prioritize our own borders over the overseas one first, and we'll elaborate on that further. But then moving on to rebuttals, where they talked about how just because it's your country doesn't make your suffering more important, and it's very nationalistic. However, Judge, we tell you that we are not against the aid to overseas country. We recognize that they are crucial and also extremely important. However, we tell you, Judge, that it's the matter of resources and resource efficiency. Sure, you can try to donate a few thousand, but will corruption allow that? Will exchange of goods allow that? Would the delivering fee allow that? We tell you all of this are what blocks the true resource efficiency there. And when you're wasting resources that could be redirected to another cause for a better solution in the end, you're completely wasting everything, right? But Judge, we will also give an alternative to also help the other countries in the world and is more effective. We'll elaborate on that further on my extension. But then again on the second clash, where they talked about how under our country one gets a paper cut and the other is burning alive. But Judge, we tell you how much they're extremely exaggerating the situation. Because just because it's in our country doesn't mean that the crises are worse or the crises are better. There are still people starving on the streets. There are still people homeless. There are still people jobless. And there are still people who need support. So we tell you that this case falls then, right? But now let me move on to my extension. Panels under opposition side of the house. Sure, there may be incentive to help, but when it's overseas, we need to remember that resources will not be able to reach with maximum efficiency and usage from things like administrative and transfer cost, corruption and mismanagement, mismatch of needs and exchange rate and logistic losses that severely waste lots of materials and resources that could be redirected into better causes. These are all of the risks that stand with overseas management. That's why we don't stand against helping countries, we stand against the consequences that come with it. Judge, we tell you that when you're doing overseas aid, there's always this huge risk of items being wasted, and you never truly have a guarantee that your funds and resources are being used efficiently or materials are being used correctly. However, under our side, when you're helping locally, you're getting the benefit of efficient delivery that doesn't require much waste, especially for shipping and expensive requirements like exchange rates and when you're doing it overseas. And adding to that, under our side, we give transparency, trackability, efficient resource usage to ensure that none are wasted or misused and everything is truly used at its maximum capability, right? But why does this become essential then? Because locally, when governments and charities can understand the problem better and therefore fix it better, these are when issues are understood better under our side. They are solved efficiently without waste and without dependency. But then when you're sending temporary help to overseas country, you're making them dependent on you. The second you stop, they will not have a metric of their own and will be too reliant. And this is already taking opposition on their best case scenario where resources even reach the other countries. Whereas locally, they can truly fix the root cause of the problems, where local programs can create lasting change through jobs, education, and healthcare. As management is better and problems are truly understood, this is the core of the issue, and this is why we would rather relocate our resources into local countries first, then, right? But then, what alternative do we give you for overseas countries then? We tell you that after fixing the problems in our own country and allowing it more strength and power, your country could then help the struggling countries through things like treaties, agreements, or things organized by big organizations like the UN. We tell you our metric like this is a lot safer and efficient to help the countries in crises because when governments are involved, that's when the picture gets much clearer and much transparent and resources are actually used efficiently rather than wasted. Then dependency is removed by proper management. For all these reasons, I strongly propose. Thank you.
Person who wins this debate today is the one who's able to direct these funds to the one who's critically suffering and endangered more. Now, who are these people? These people look like on our world, these people who are suffering from these wars and disasters, who are equally suffering at the same level as these less privileged, if not worse, on our side, and that is why they deserve it so more. So proud to then oppose. One major thing that they push on their side of the debate is how less privileged are essentially more in need of it. I just think a few things to this. First, on how, I think we equally solve these issues, right? Because reminder then, Judge, it's not about forgetting about these less privileged at the end of the day, but it's about, not putting them as our biggest priority, because there are obviously people out there dying who need it much more. I think if the problem in the country is, things like absolute poverty or things like education, the government is still able to do things like give food aid and basic access to healthcare, and, developed countries will obviously give development if that's needed. But I think at the end of the day, something else we try to tell you here is that even if, Judge, they manage to prove why this is better on their side, many of these less privileged people suffer due to the fact of who they voted with in the first place, which is only then them to blame. What's another thing they tell you? They tell you things like efficiency issue and how efficiency is just so much better on their side. I think this is a massive exaggeration because equally on our side, what does this process honestly just look like? It looks like taxing people. Funding wise, you only need 60 USD a month to pay for 3 meals of a kid who's suffering from hunger. That exaggeration of this shipment just to get this to there is honestly not that bad because just take basic shipment for example, right? It does not take a whole year to get there. I do not know why they think it's that bad. But then overall, Now let me tell you my first two arguments of this debate, right? First, on how the problem of less fortunate people experience domestically is only a result of their own bad choice. Giving you examples like Trump supporters, right? Losing their welfare benefits to the government shutdown when Republican controls both the House and Trump is refusing to make it work. That is honestly just to blame these citizens within the first place. But I think the comparative problems overseas, which is existential, which is a life or death situation, meaning things like war in Gaza, where people did not vote for Zionists, who basically someone who protects the Jews, supporting the government, it's just something that needs a lot more help on. So what then? I think opposition war looks like where people are still surviving, right? People have some level of funding, but they just need things like at least jobs or educational food. But because I think we already told you, this happens at the same level, if not worse, on our side to a worse extent, and that is why they need these resources much more in this crucial situation, right? I think second argument then on how very easy and effective, I'll take that PR later, how easy and effective it is just in general to help a lot of these countries. So who do these countries helping look like? They look like a lot of developed helping help big massive developing countries, or if not at least a country that has a much better economic stability than these critically endangered countries look like, right? So note then, Judge, the only reason why governments from other countries don't really help with it in the first place because it just simply doesn't affect their country within the first place. They wouldn't put their funds elsewhere if it doesn't benefit them. And I think that's just so morally wrong, right? Because not only then is it immoral to do that, but it's also selfish for the country when there are people literally dying out there while you just have people at the bare minimum on side proposition. So how does this reallocation look like? I think we already told you, right? It's a very simple process of just taxing people and sending it over. But the impact you get here from this efficiency is very profound. Meaning things like lives are saved from starvation, disease, and disaster. You have things like community stabilization, where you reduce the risk of collapsation, conflict, or mass migration. And you have things like where children are receiving this education, we're breaking cycles of poverty and dependence on our side of the world where they're suffering from this due to this critical danger. And I think, Judge, if we're able to prove to you then how equally on our side it's worse for these people, if not it's worse for these people on our side, this is why they essentially deserve these resources much more than these less privileged do. Thank you.
I think side op's biggest mistake in this debate was thinking that this debate is about kindness and morality and compassion. It's not. It's about incentives, purpose, and impact. You cannot extinguish others' fire when your fire is still ongoing. So proud to propose. Moving on to my rebuttals then. Firstly, about how we need to help the other countries that are suffering more than us, which is basically side opposition's most contingent and most spoken about argument that has been repeated a lot of times. Two responses then. Firstly, I think from the very point that side opposition said this, it's clear that they misunderstood what we're talking about. This debate isn't about morality. It's about whether you're kind or not. It's about strategy. We're not saying that you shouldn't help other countries because you can and you're supposed to. You're supported to do that. It's called ensuring greater diplomatic relations, right? But when you prioritize other countries' safety over your own country, when you're literally still suffering, then that's not called compassion. That's called being a neglectful government who feeds the other countries while their own people are starving. That's also selfish in of it itself. Side opposition needs to understand that your own job as a government from the very get-go is to improve your own country and not help others, at least not prioritizing others more than yourself. And this has been consistently said throughout all of side proposition speeches, because side opposition doesn't seem to get it. And yes, we need to help other countries suffering who are more than us, but the reality is that we ourselves are still suffering, and you cannot expect to help others efficiently if you cannot even help yourself, if you cannot even stand on your own ground. That's why when a plane gets low on oxygen, you put on your own mask first before helping a child. And there are also people in your country dying. Although other countries may have more death, you need to fix your own problem first before helping others. And secondly, then, we're not making other countries drown. Note that we're literally not the only ones who are helping the country in need, and there's always going to be other worldwide organizations like the UN who are helping them and funding for them. So that's why that they're never going to be left alone and nobody's going to help them. That is simply not a case that is going to happen at all, because we are also not the only countries who are going to be helping them. So I don't think that this argument stands, and this overall argument from side opposition clearly falls, right? Moving on to my second rebuttal then. about how helping global issues overseas helps to prevent global issues stem from global conflicts. And we agree that global conflict is, of course, the problem, right? But we tell you that most conflicts are started by countries that are already weak, already unstable, or have deep internal problems like poverty and inequality. And you cannot expect a country to be a peaceful neighbor if their own citizens are starving, unemployed, and desperate inside its borders. And the best way to stop a country from causing conflict abroad is to ensure that it is stable and prosperous at home. Your government has the most direct power to fix
EOI.
causes within your own country. Yes.
Assuming that these countries are already fully developed countries, they have the necessary resources, if not even more, to actually help these other countries. So why, on your side, do you think that they shouldn't?
Well, it's not because whether they're developing or developed, and even if it is about that, from the very get-go, our speech has been saying that we are revolving around a developing, helping another developing country. But even if I take that point of yours, why do we still win then? It's simple, right? It is about moral. It's about strategy, right? When governments are elected, they are meant to provide their own country's improvement, not other countries. So that is just the basic foundation that we need to understand this debate. That side opposition has to understand this too. Lastly, then, about how exaggeration for shipment and processing. We tell you that side opposition isn't looking at the issues like currency exchange fees, custom taxes, and transport damage that reduce the real value of what is given. Shipment, especially to areas in conflict or crisis, is a lot harder and a lot more complicated as well as hard to manage and track than a simple delivery. It takes extremely long with lots of procedures to go through because those countries are still at war, right? Moving on to my very final weighing then, is that on side proposition, we win under two metrics. Firstly, practicality, and secondly, purpose of a country, and thirdly, country's dependency and independence, because helping other countries too much makes those countries dependent on you, so once you stop helping them, they're left weaker than before. On the basis of countries' diplomatic relations and hospitality, we're so proud to propose. Thank you.
Things in this speech. Firstly, I'll be giving a few rebuttals to side proposition. Secondly, I'll be analyzing the two main clashes of this debate. And lastly, I will tell you why opposition should win this debate. So allow me to start my speech with a few rebuttals. The main point that a proposition raises is that when you send aid to overseas countries, there are many other costs that we don't consider, such as transportation and resource inefficiency and possibly corruption. However, we think that, like, looking at a historical basis, the actual resources needed are much less than proposition exaggerates. So, like, are you really willing to let millions of people in another country die just because you have to like pay some small like currency exchange fee? Um, they they also talked about things like corruption, right? However, we think that this can be symmetrical and can happen on both sides because many governments in like the current status quo and in propositions world may say that they're actually giving welfare or help to these less privileged people when they actually don't. They also talk about how they have alternatives to help people overseas. However, it is just simply not the priority, right? I'll take it later. However, we think that this won't be as effective because when helping people overseas is not the main priority, then there will clearly not be as much emphasis on it. And we think that this emphasis and priority is needed for these crucial situations. Resource inefficiency and other impacts that they have stated will be even more severe when giving aid to people overseas is not the main focus. So we think that on their side, overseas people won't be helped, even though the scale of harm that they're facing is much, much worse. So lastly, the third speaker talked about how these countries need to be able to fix their own problems before helping others. However, we are assuming that these countries who are giving help to others are developed countries, right? Which means that they're stable enough to the point where they're able to provide aid to other countries and like they have enough resources to do so. Developing countries who can barely even provide for their own citizens are obviously like not part of this debate and will not be giving overseas aid to others. And the last thing that the third speaker brought up was that these developing countries will be left weaker after like receiving overseas aid, and they'll be too dependent on this. However, we think that when they meet a crisis, they don't get completely dependent on these developed countries, and they actually use this resource as a stepping stone to get back onto their feet and to get back to their old ways. Other rebuttals will be incorporated into clashes. So the first clash of this debate is which side has a better foundation of morality. Proposition talks about how the citizens are the ones who pay taxes, so morally that we should be able to help them, right? However, on opposition, clarification is that we aren't saying that we don't help these citizens.
We're simply just saying that okay, yeah, I'll take it now.
So you said that the countries who are helping other countries are developed countries, but you still know that even a developed country like Britain has tens of thousands of homeless people who are literally dying too.
Okay, I'll get to that right now, but right. So we say that in many of these developed countries, there are many alternatives that still exist as it is a developed country. So there are many mechanisms in place that actually help these less privileged people. For example, there are things like welfare provided for them, and there are also many NGOs. Like there are many NGOs that actually help these less privileged people. So we're saying that we don't simply ignore them. So um um and additionally, many of these developed countries are actually one of the main factors that cause these overseas problems in these developing countries. For example, climate change, right? Developing countries are suffering from the impacts of climate change disproportionately, and developed countries are the main creator of climate change. So we believe that is morally correct for developed countries to like provide overseas aid to these developing countries as a form of reparation. So, um, um, so in conclusion from what we have told you today, this is why we think that opposition should take this debate home. Thank you.
Member of panel, today's debate isn't about choosing between two gods. It's about choosing the greater moral clarity, strategic impact, and global responsibility, which lies firmly with the opposition. Our burden is to prove why helping people overseas is equally important to helping people domestically, and why assisting more vulnerable and critical individuals is then essentially better. So what do we think is the biggest clash and the biggest deadlock that no one has really been able to solve? So what have Prop told you? They tell you things like how we owe more to our fellow citizens, charity begins at home. Because we as art, we keep pushing the fact that moral is not determined by nationality and needs an impact and should receive this guide aid. But honestly, Judge, I think this whole debate just has been a massive wash with no viewpoint, because the fact that Prop keeps trying to push the fact that it's all about strategy and not compassion, was we give you a world that's about compassion and not strategy. So I think equally on both sides, we're able to help both aspects. However, who then genuinely needs it more? So think about it, Judge. Just think about it logically. The amount of people they benefit is not equally as much as us. Because who do we benefit at the end of the day? They benefit like things like the minorities, right? Most in their world. But who do we say? We benefit everyone, the majority and the minorities, everyone who is then essentially suffering. So note then, Judge, it's much worse in these countries experiencing this crisis, because not only are they at the same level as these less privileged people, meaning bad living standard, no jobs, no education, whatever, but they're also at things like reducing the risk of collapse conflicts that may arise between groups, and things like mass migration, which only we uniquely solve on our side. So why do we then win? I think we win on a few three reasons. A, on how we're able to reject borders as a basis for compassion. B, on how aid is directed by urgency and severity, not location. And C, how a starving child overseas is not less deserving than a hungry citizen. Thus, this framing avoids moral relativism and affirms equal human dignity. And I think, Judge, if we're able to prove to you these things today, this is why we essentially win this debate. Thank you.
Side opposition lost this debate from the very get-go, because throughout this entire debate, side opposition stance has been clear about their stance. Do they want a balance, or do they want helping people overseas to be prioritized? Now, some strategic mistakes then. First, side opposition made a comparison between a person dying and a minor paper cut, but panels, we tell you that this is an extreme and unfair comparison. Yes, we do acknowledge that the situation in the affected countries are major, but portraying lack of access to basic necessities as a minor problem, or in their example, a minor paper cut, is just not the same, and again, it's not fair. And second, they also mentioned that we exaggerated our point of shipment and processing, but the thing is, panels, it's not an exaggeration. It already happens in the status quo. It's something that is not preventable, and even if it is preventable, which we tell you that it's not, so opposition never actually gave a possible solution to this, right? And we tell you that because they failed to do so, it's already obvious that we win. And next, they also think that by one country helping another, we can automatically save millions, and this is just an exaggeration. They also mentioned that in developed countries, there are external factors that help their poor people, but we tell you that the citizens experience little to no change, and moreover, organizations and other countries would also help those affected countries. And lastly, you can't say that we don't focus on compassion and we only focus on strategy, because diplomacy and politics has always been about strategy. It shouldn't be played with, it's serious. So moving on then. First, we posit that countries have national responsibilities and one can never ensure that the aid will reach another country properly. And their response to this was that we are exaggerating nationalism and we should help the other countries that suffer more than us. But why do we win this clash then? Sending aid overseas may sound morally good, but if that aid never reaches the victims due to war or interference, then the effort is wasted. And we also tell you that just because you feel responsible for your own country, your own nation, it doesn't immediately mean you're exaggerating it. And next, they told you that helping global issues help to prevent future conflicts, but this is not enough because preventing future conflicts requires stability and strength at home first. And like a country struggling with poverty or inequality cannot effectively contribute to global peace. So, and to extend on what my third speaker said, we want under two metrics set. First, practicality, as in sustainability, as we ensure that the foundational structure, which is the country helping, is built efficiently first before helping out other countries in need. And second, purpose of a country that stems from national responsibility, because as a government, your role is literally made that powerful to serve your own people and your own country. So for all those reasons, then you must vote for side proposition. Thank you.